Hi, Dr. Mike. How are you doing?
Hey, what's up?
Good to see you. Welcome back to the gram.
Thank
How
you
you
so
been?
much. I've been okay. How about you?
Very well too. You've been in Instagram limbo. What happened there, Dr. Mike?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure. I'm reasonably sure that there was a post in June of this past year in which it's like a picture of my face, and I must have said something in the post that upset somebody because the I believe that
Right.
picture a few months later was labeled as unsafe, made people feel unsafe, and then they labeled my account unsafe, and I think they deleted it. So
Yeah, it was probably one of those glued shots in the bodybuilding community that
it
that make
wasn't.
everybody frown.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was just my face. Yeah. So
Yeah, Instagram, it's quite weird. But anyway, thanks a lot for your time. It's a great pleasure to talk to you again, Dr. Mike.
well, it's
So,
always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
oh, thank you, man. So the topic at hand, I wanted to talk to you about this because I know you fairly recently kind of changed your mind. To quote yourself, actually, you in a video of RP Strength, you said something like, Dr. Eric Drexler told you anyone. It was something along those lines in regards to
Say
P
that again.
ratio. What? I'm sorry?
Say that again.
Yeah, sure. That you had a discussion with Dr. Eric Drexler, and then in an RP Strength video, you said that I'm quoting you that he told you anyone in regards to P ratio and all that stuff. Because you kind of change your mind in all these topics, right? I don't know if you recall
Uh,
that. But anyway, the case, don't worry. The case at hand being P ratio in regards to muscle gain.
yeah.
Because also I recall in the Minicode manual that maybe losing some fat was actually beneficial for bettering your P ratio. But in regards to all these recent discussions, maybe we are not so sure that that would be the point. That was what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry if
Yes.
I
Yes.
didn't
Very,
explain
very,
it
very
correctly.
correct. No, no, that's very fine. Yes.
Very well. So can we begin by defining what is P ratio so that we are on the same page, Dr. Mike?
Totally. So P ratio stands for partitioning ratio. It is the fraction of new tissue that you gain when you train and eat, and fraction of tissue that is muscle versus fat.
Right.
And technically, it works in reverse. So if you lose amount of weight, a good P ratio would be to lose a minimum amount of muscle and maximum amount of fat. Sometimes, as Greg and Eric have demonstrated in a few of the write-ups, you can have negative P ratios when people lose fat and at the same time gain muscle. That's pretty sweet. So
Right, right.
that's generally the P ratio.
Very well, because we have some sort of maybe misconceptions there. Because in one hand, we have body recomposition, that let's say people with high body fat can actually lose that set fat and gain muscle. But on the other hand, we say that people that higher body fats cannot continue to gain muscle. And I think there's a little bit of, let's say, contradiction there. Maybe I'm missing something there. But can we sort of set the big rocks for this discussion after establishing what is P ratio? Is a surplus ultimately required for hypertrophy, or up to what point can we just keep recomping and recomping?
Hmm. So earlier you said, people who are very fat tend to be able to recomp better.
Right.
There is a lurking variable there, which I think explains a lot of why they can. And that's very fat people tend to also be predominantly untrained or undertrained. So, what we think is a really impressive recomposition powered by extra body fat stores is maybe just the untrained state. And we know that being untrained is a real good way to, allow you to have some recomposition happen. So, it's not clear to me that if someone is very well trained and they decide that they put on 40 pounds of fat, and after that 40 pounds is on, that their muscle gain process is now easier, given that they're 40 pounds fatter. I have myself done this many, many times and drug free and gotten real fat and then tried to recomp. It just doesn't work all that well.
Right.
Certainly to me, it didn't seem to work any better than gaining slowly and not getting ultra fat. That's the one point. Next point to the latter part of the question is, can we recomp forever? And the answer is no. And I can give you some specific information. I think anytime females reach into the 17 to 15% body fat, maybe a little higher, and the average male reaches about 10% body fat, anything below 10 is considered very lean. And it presses really heavily against all the regulatory mechanisms. And that heavy pressure against those mechanisms means that your propensity to get even less fat is lower. It's difficult to get less fat at that point. And if you simultaneously try to gain muscle, you have removed much of the anabolic signaling. And as a matter of fact, under 10% body fat is when you encounter a lot of catabolic signaling. Like holding on to muscle is hard enough. The idea that you could recomp below 10% is probably fallacious in most cases. Right? It just probably doesn't happen. Nothing to send, to talk about. Recomping tends to happen at above 10% body fat and at higher percentages of fat. But generally speaking, it's interesting. My phone keeps. Let me know if I lose you. I'll just come back. My phone seems to want to go to sleep all the time. It's like doing this thing where it grays out. You can still hear me and everything, right? I just hope it doesn't turn off after this. It's weird because it's
no issues so far. Oh, there you go. Lost you for a minute, but there you go. All cool. There you go. I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Hopefully that won't come back. So recomping becomes definitely very close to impossible, below 10% for males and below sort of 18% for females. And you said something earlier that was like, is a surplus required for muscle growth? No, but almost nothing is required for muscle growth. It's simply the addition of other variables simply increases the amount of muscle growth or the probability that you will experience a certain amount of muscle growth. So for example, you can gain muscle in many cases without a surplus, but you take all those identical cases and the only thing you change is you introduce a surplus, and almost always the muscle gain results will be better. So a surplus is something we should want to use, not something that we will try to get away from. I don't want to have to do a surplus. Like, well, you want the most growth. Yes, we should probably do a surplus when you're trying to grow for a ton of reasons. But hormonally, if anything, the hypercaloric condition, it raises your basal insulin. It raises your anabolic hormones if you're drug-free. It makes the availability of nutrients almost instant to any part of the body that may need them. And there's a bunch of other mechanisms. For example, glycogen storage is actually a regulator of hypertrophy. So there's at least one mechanism they discovered that when your glycogen stores are nearly full, you essentially give the all clear to the rest of the cell to make more muscle protein. If your glycogen stores are very low, it actually actively inhibits muscle growth from occurring. So how do you get the highest glycogen stores chronically? Surplus really does the trick. At least maintenance, we're probably surplus. And then you talk about recomp, especially if you're trying to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. Losing fat, but at the same time having maxed glycogen stores is just not really in the cards. So it's one of those things that if you want to make things more difficult for yourself, recomping always instead of gaining some weight is a good idea. If you want to make things easiest on yourself or get the best results, probably try to plan most of your gaining phases in a surplus.
Very well. So the key component here being obviously resistance training. When we talk about obese population and when we talk about athletes, the presence of resistance training then can justify the presence of a caloric surplus to get all the set benefits of set surplus. But in regards to the P ratio itself, how did this notion came to be? As far as I know, it was in this Forbes model from the 80s, something like that, that was done in mostly anorexic women in recovery. And then we kind of adopted this notion of P ratio in athletes. Can we talk a little bit of that, the historic conception of P ratio, Dr. Mike?
Yeah, totally. I would. So that's definitely a thing. And I would say that there's another bigger reason that method was adopted. As most people don't read the literature, the first person, in my view, that summed up that literature quite expansively was, I think, Lyle McDonald. And as usual, he, drew two mutually contradictory conclusions at the end. I believe insulted the reader, and then that was that article. So,
Always.
yeah, but
I can see that.
for what it's worth, there's not a whole lot of people read Lyle. It's got some good stuff. Probably more people should read. But
Sure.
I don't think that Forbes article made the rounds in anything but the nerdiest apex of drug-free bodybuilding. I will say there are two factors, I think, that predispose people to believe that the P ratio is something that declined when you got fatter. And here are the two factors in
Right.
my view. Factor number one is that people naturally are biased to want to be as lean as possible. And if you give them some kind of reason, not even a compelling reason, they will be very amenable to accepting that reason so that they can justify their own sort of internal sociological biases. For example, if you said, hey, making lots of money is bad for your health. Here's all the studies. A lot of people would be like, shit, that's stupid trade-offs. But if you had a study or a bunch of studies saying making a lot of money is actually really good for your health, it's like right kind of stress for your body, and there's a hormetic response. I mean, a lot of people would be like, oh my God, great. Oh my God, business and health together. This is amazing. I want to believe, right? So for the P ratio thing, I think a lot of people really don't like getting fat. And if you told them, look, you got to get fat to keep getting the gains, it's just a part of life, which is what I've told a lot of people for a long time, used to anyway. And they're like, fuck. Nobody wants to hear that. Like, I got to get fat, fuck that. And then if you tell them, actually, if you stay lean or every now and again recycle back to being really lean, you get even better gains. Man, a lot of people have time for that. They really want to hear that. So it's a little bit of a biasing factor in that respect. I'm saying another factor is the fact that in the observations of probably a huge fraction of bodybuilders and people who have just, fucked around with trying to gain weight and muscle and not fat, a lot of people have noticed that once they get past a certain level of fat, they don't seem to gain all that much muscle anymore. And they can gain fat real easy, but not muscle real easy. And maybe there are definitely problems with that view. That's not a very holistic view. There are ways in which other confounding variables can be lurking there. And actually, it's not really the fat, it's something else. But nonetheless, people have observed that. So for example, just to put an example to the story, a lot of guys have observed that when they go from 10 to roughly 20% body fat, they get great muscle gains, especially if they do so slowly. Plenty of fat, but plenty of muscle. So those other people that have gotten plenty of muscle all the way up to 20, sometimes they go to 20 to 25 or even to 30 or something. And most of them are very let down. They don't get the kind of muscle gains they used to. And that could be for a variety of reasons, but I think the suspicion there was that maybe it's the adiposity, the excess adiposity, that is actually a problem for that process. And if that's really the case, then, there is your sort of multivariate reason why I think a lot of people bought into the P ratio sort of as described earlier. You had Lyle McDonald summary of the Forbes studies. You have the idea that people just want to be lean anyway. And any way you tell them like, hey, being lean is good even for muscle gain, they'd be like, sweet. And then the last thing is bodybuilding tends to, the observations have said that, at least past a certain point, it seems like the bulking life just doesn't make any sense as far as how much muscle we're getting for how much fat we're putting on. So I think that's what formed the earlier thoughts, the pre-Trexler era, I could call it.
Yeah, the pre-Trexler era. Yeah, because after that study in rodents from the Sousa, it kind of came back to life again, all this P-ratio discussion. And just to clarify, it's really the nitty-gritty aspects of all bulking life per se. It's not that you have to have a certain exact body fat, because quantifying body fat in itself, it's quite complicated, which I wanted to ask you actually. Mm-hmm. How do you establish a body fat? Do you use calipers? Do you use perhaps the US Navy formula, which is kind of easier, visually assessing? How can we say you are something along 20%, something along 15%? Because there can be a big margin of error depending on the methods we use.
Yeah. I hardly use any of those methods. I use the DEXA, and then I use skin calipers during a diet to track changes, although they don't give me absolute values of body fat percentage. And then I use the mirror and the scale. And I understand the literature and the theory well enough to know that it's not an exact number I'm looking for. It's a range, and I can tell ranges visually quite easy. And I can, later, I suppose, I'll tell you what exactly I think the P ratio discussion has produced as the best course of action for most people, or sort of what we can take from it. And based on what I take from it, for me, the visual assessment is almost everything that I need. So I can get into that now if you'd like, but yeah, I don't. I think using things like a 3-site, 7-site caliper, By the way, I used to be the person that did body fat testing for entire teams of athletes in my PhD. Like I know how to do a 7-site skin fold and grab properly. It's not like this, it's like that, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It still is a very excellent test if you want group averages. Which team is fatter, the volleyball team or the soccer team? Easy. But if you want individual changes over time, especially relevant time scales like 3 or 4 weeks, it's close to nonsense. And the DEXA is just a little bit better, slightly more reliable, more precise, more accurate. But, it's not much better. It's just something that you do maybe once a year to see kind of how am I doing, so on and so forth. But
Yeah, because having access to a DEXA, well,
well, yeah. So, you live in Mexico?
Mexico, that's right.
So in the United States, the vast majority of large cities have private DEXA facilities that you just book, and for like $100, you just get a DEXA. It's not an access problem anymore. It used to be about 10 years ago. You really had to find one, like a university. Nowadays, they're ubiquitous. In Las Vegas, there are like 3 DEXA places. And we knew one of the ladies. She knew who Jared was. Of course, when Jared Feather walked in, she's like, "You're Jared Feather," and he's like, "Oh, so I am." But she got us all DEXAs, and we paid, and it was really easy. So, but yeah, access used to be a problem, but now I think it's quite reasonable. Not that people should be getting DEXAs all the fucking time, but that's a whole
Right. Yeah, sure. Kind of unpractical. So very well. So now we know what is P ratio, where does P ratio came from, all the, let's say, biosocial, well, sales implications of people, why they want to get lean, be lean all the time, especially in bodybuilders.
Sure.
But what about indirect evidence? Let's say football players that have carry quite a bit of body fat, but keep gaining muscle. They have the most muscle of all the team, perhaps. Or if we go to the extreme of the spectrum, let's say sumo wrestlers that carry quite the amount of body fat, but also have insane amounts of lean body mass.
They don't have insane amounts of lean body mass.
Well, for natural individuals, perhaps.
That's nice. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. I very, very well parsed all of this. So the football players, interesting data. Certainly makes us think that, okay, there's not a real strong linear relationship between the leaner you get, closer to 10%, the more muscle you gain, versus the more you get close to 20, 25%, the less muscle you gain. It definitely, that research on football players certainly puts a skeptical eye to that. Other thing is, there's a lot of difference between position players in American football, mostly genetically. These are genetically very different people. The people that are running backs and wide receivers, who are the leanest people on the team, they're not the most prone to gaining muscle, but they're also super prone to being lean all the fucking time. And a lot of times, they don't actually eat enough to gain a lot of weight. They don't want to gain a lot of weight because they want to stay roughly the same size because speed is important. On the other hand, linemen, offensive, defensive, they tend to have a very different genetic profile. They have carried lots of body fat their whole lives and lots of muscle. They're genetically absolutely gifted at putting on both. So when they weight train and they eat remotely well, they put on crap loads of muscle and probably no fat because they're super elite genetics. But, while, how do I phrase this best? They are often, at various points of the year, wildly untrained and become untrained again quite often. So these kinds of resistance training studies in American football players, I think to the average drug-free, scientifically evidence-based person who reads literature, they go, "Oh, it's a football player. That's a serious athlete. He trains as hard as I do." I would say I used to train football players for a long time at a few different schools, Division I, top tier guys, and went to the NFL. And I'd say, out of all the football players I've ever met and trained in real life, maybe 1 or 2 out of a couple hundred that I've met has the dedication of your average person that reads James Krieger's blog or something. These people do everything possible to avoid hard work, even when it's right there in front of them. They sometimes like playing American football, but maybe not often. They're just really good at it, and they get laid a lot playing it and get money, so they seem to think it's fine. And a lot of times they're not very dedicated with training, and then if you don't watch them, they stop training or do much less training. And then, so they would really, I would say, best slotted into the recreationally trained / untrained category. We can see wacky shit. Good God, I think I'm dying. This is the last time you see me. So that's for the football players. So I think those results, looking at them, we need to temper our understanding what those results are. We don't need to throw them out and say, "Oh, it's all bullshit. They're not untrained." I'd say, yeah, those results definitely say something, but the extremity to which they can take their message of, hey, you can be super fat and still get the best gains is probably mildly tempered to oh, maybe that's a thing, or maybe it's less of a thing than we thought. Sumo wrestlers, points perseverately brought up all the time. I don't think anyone's ever made a claim, or certainly I haven't, and I haven't seen anyone intelligent make the claim, that as you gain total body weight and fat, that your muscle gains go into zero or negative. I think a claim has been made that in a certain body fat range, you'll get a higher proportion of muscle gain, a higher P ratio, than than you would at a fatter state. But I don't think anyone's ever claimed that, like, if you get beyond 30% fat, any additional amount you gain, even with resistance training, is just going to be fat. As a matter of fact, it's going to start eating away your muscle. So you're really, really off to bad shape. So when people say the sumo wrestlers have the most lean body mass, it's true as far as natural athletes go. It's not even remotely true as far as like professional strongmen and stuff are concerned. But
Right.
and remember, as a professional strongman tend to be considerably leaner. So it could leave us wanting, like, interesting. Okay, so there's at least a counterexample there. But with sumo wrestlers, I think the big lesson for sumo wrestlers is, look, if you keep gaining weight and fat and you don't give a shit how much fat, you'll still gain muscle, probably for until you're, in your 40s or something. The question is, what would you gain marginally more muscle and less fat if you were leaner? And the answer to that is maybe. But the answer to that might still be no, because if you were to gain marginally more muscle as a fraction of total weight gained, because you're trying to cap your body weight so low and gain so slowly because you don't want to be a fat fuck sumo wrestler, the sumo wrestlers may actually exhibit absolutely larger muscle gains per week or per month or per year than people trying to stay on the P ratio side of things and be leaner. But they pay for this with an exorbitant amount of body fat. And I think it's particularly, maybe like, how should I say this? Not a great PR move to front too much of the argument based on sumo wrestlers, because it is methodologically is maybe a very sound argument that, okay, you made some points, sumo wrestlers still gain muscle, you don't become allergic to gaining muscle when you get really fat, the P ratio is overstated, all those things are probably true. But if we say, look, you'll still gain muscle if you get fat. Well, like sumo wrestlers, who the fuck wants to look like a sumo wrestler? As a more intelligent person, more aware of literature, could respond to that, being like, well, that's nice, but I don't want anything to do with sumo wrestlers. I don't care how muscular they are. If they're paying for that muscularity with 90 pounds of excess fat, I don't give a shit how they got there. And if you tell me, look, the only way to gain 200 kilos of muscle is to go sumo, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to be 200 kilos of muscle. I want to be 180 kilos, but with some abs or some shit, like Hafthor Bjornsson or something like that. And even if Hafthor could gain more muscle, which he almost certainly could if he just got real nonsense fat, it's the absolute gain is nice, but the relative gain is dog shit. And I think if you look at it from a relative perspective, the sumo argument turns in on itself. And it's like, well, fuck, man. Look, if you made the point that people still gain muscle as they get fatter, I get it. But at what cost? And the cost is an insane amount of body fat. Never mind the health decrements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
That's actually what I wanted to touch on, that very extreme example of sumo wrestlers. The health costs, let's say insulin resistance, all that stuff. What can be impacted when we take things to the limit? And let's take those guys, for example. Not just body fat, but also the health concerns.
All right. Joints. You're walking around weighing 500 pounds is fucking up your joints, probably permanently. And you got a timeline there that's not very long. You're going to have problems with blood pressure, almost certainly. You would have to be heavily medicated to not have problems with high blood pressure. Whether or not you have problems with high blood pressure, you're actually introducing a number of situations on a daily basis for your heart to have to work really, really, really hard against a ton of back pressure. And that tends to cause cardiovascular hypertrophy of the maladaptive kind, which means you're slowly dying. And can you tell that motherfucker outside to stop honking his horn? I'm just kidding.
I can, man. I can.
No, don't. You're like way too jacked for that part of town. They probably freak out.
To do that. Yeah, don't worry. Sorry about that, man.
Yeah, if you do it, just please do a lot of swearing in Spanish really fast.
Dr. Mike told me to. Yeah, that's what I'm going.
So basically, I think when you get that heavy, most doctors in obesity medicine will put like a rough timeline on when you will begin to have heart failure. And heart failure means your heart insufficiently is able to pump your blood around. So you start having what's called distal edema, which is when your ankles and calves swell up. And that's from fluid that your blood supply can no longer move out of the area. And then, you have all increase. So triglycerides go like crazy, insulin dynamic go like crazy. So you become type 2 diabetic. Your chance of stroke enormously climbs, your chance of heart attack, your chance of sleep apnea goes up a lot. So your quality of sleep declines, which is more obesogenic. It's a nasty cycle you want no part of. Oh, it's, by the way, probably the worst part is the daily quality of life. I mean, like, if you do a set of 10 on the deadlift and you try to walk across the gym, you may accumulate lactic acid in your back just from that set of 10 deadlift, and you have to lean on something. People who weigh 500 pounds, they're like that all the time. There's always feel like they just did a set of 10 on the deadlift when they're walking anywhere. I mean, geez, fuck that. So real bad news, something most people just don't want.
Yeah, I think I ramped it up too much with the with the sumo wrestling example.
No. Yeah, but to give you credit and to give the folks like, I think Eric Helms is a big fan of the sumo wrestler example. It does illustrate the idea that, look, like, there's no amount of fat you can gain reasonably. I'll talk about the other side, because there's unreasonable amounts of fat that you can gain that have other problems that will put your muscle gains to a stop. So you will still continue to gain muscle, but it may now come at a really high amount of fat with it. And the P ratio, what it might do is so there's an absolute level of muscle mass gained, and then the amount of fat you gain with it. Sumo might be here, P ratio might be here, and the ratio is better, but the absolute gains are smaller because you're leaner and you're going slower. And you could tell someone, look, you would get better absolute gains if you just got fat as fuck. But then the answer always comes back to this is, okay, then what do I do? Now that I'm enormous and super unhealthy and I've permanently stretched skin and a permanently higher number of fat cells, adipocytes, that continuously exert their hormonal influence to make me hungrier all the time and always try to fill up with either fluid or fat whenever they get the chance. Fuck that. I don't want any part of that. So the sumo thing is not somewhere we want to go outside of the theoretical admission that, yeah, look, there's never, your P ratio probably doesn't go negative. So it's not like at some point, some people have really mischaracterized the P ratio, and they'll say, if they see someone gaining from 20% fat to 25% while they're resist training and everything, they'll be like, you fucking idiot, bro. You're too fat. You'll just gain all fat. Bullshit. You'll gain muscle, plenty of muscle. The question is, at what cost of fractional amount of fat gained with it?
Very well. One argument that also keeps popping up in the P ratio discussion is insulin sensitivity. That perhaps if we keep raising our body fat, let's not talk about sumo anymore, and not that extreme example. Let's say a male with 20% something body fat. Is this really a concern? Because we're talking about people that are engaging in resistance training, and we know that just one bout of resistance training can actually lower blood glucose. So is it really a concern in regards to muscle gain and also to health concerns? To be on the 20-ish side of body fat of things in regards to insulin sensitivity?
So your insulin sensitivity might fall lower, which isn't good. It's the least good for your health. It may very, very marginally impact muscle gain, a tiny amount, maybe for the negative, but probably within a wide range of boundaries, it's probably about the same. Definitely the leaner you can be within a pretty wide berth, the leaner you can be, the healthier you are. So 20% body fat is not a very healthy body fat for males. So something like 15 is much healthier, and 10% is probably even healthier. I've done blood work my sort of entire career, especially after flipping the switch to enhanced, and regular blood work all the time. And my health is absolutely the best on the numbers every time I'm the leanest. And when I'm leanest, I'm usually on the most gear too. And it doesn't matter because being lean really, really is that healthy for you. So insulin sensitivity is a concern.
Sorry to interrupt, but lean as in show ready or as in beach ready? Because there's quite a difference.
Both. Yeah. And so when I'm close to show ready, my resting blood pressure is like an amount that I'm like, oh shit, if I stand up too quick, I'll pass out, which is very good for your health. Resting heart rate super low, blah, 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 all the way down the line. Right. So there's a funny notion that getting show lean is bad for your health. And other than a few metrics that reverse very quickly, I'm not ever so convinced that that's the case. And I think people, again, a sociocultural thing, people see weird physiques and they reflexively think, oh, that can't be healthy. Like, okay. So like they'll see, Ridley Winkler at 290 with some body fat and they'd be like, whoa, he's huge. And someone's like, is that healthy? They're like, I don't think so, but I don't know, it looks okay. And then they see Rolly Winkler at 260, completely shredded to the bone, and they go, oh, that's definitely unhealthy. And it's like, well, Rolly's probably a lot healthier when he's shredded than when he's carrying 30 pounds of extra mass or something of body fat and water. So being leaner probably is better for your health, but within a pretty wide range, it probably doesn't matter much. And there are other benefits. So for example, when you have a higher body fat percent, you probably endogenously produce a bit more testosterone and a little bit more estrogen conversion, both of which are within a wide range anabolic and complementary. You also have a lot of really good training energy. and good sleep and recovery. So north of 10% and all the way up to about 20%, I think that as you go from 10% to about 20%, and I've made this post in a few write-ups, I think, as you go from 10% to about 20%, your insulin sensitivity will marginally fall. Your serum testosterone will probably climb. Serum estrogen will probably climb, and the net anabolic effect of hormones will probably go up. But because your insulin sensitivity is down, and for a few other factors, I think your probability of gaining a certain rate of muscle versus fat is, for most people, especially as males in this example, roughly the same between 10 and 20%. Because the real nasty part of the P ratio thing was when people figured out the 10% number and they figured out that it was this great thing. And they were like, okay, the closer I am to 10, the better. And then they would get to 12% after 3 weeks of massing and be like, fuck, got to go back to 10 because 10 is where the gains are. And that's probably not true. So all the way up to about 20% is probably very safe territory. And it could be argued one way or the other that one is better than the other. But I think, as my reading of the literature and from lots of experience, it's probably right around pretty much equivalent for drug-free people. For drug-using people, especially if they use growth hormone and things like that, being leaner is even better. But it is also very much easier in that case. So I would say 10 to 20% is probably pretty even. If we may, let's talk real quick about what happens north of 20%. Okay, so north of 20%, 22, 23, 25, et cetera, we have a couple of problems which may be avoided for best practice by the average person who trains, and especially a physique-oriented person who wants to be serious about it. Problem number one is that when you get that fat, your training work capacity can actually fall. But you may be inclined to do high rep legs when you're 15% body fat, but at 25%, you are going to be limited by your cardiovascular ability. You're not even going to be limited by your legs. I don't know if you've been there before.
One set of 5 and you're fried, man.
Bro, like five reps and you're breathing
and that's
almost throwing up. And it's like, fuck, man, that's like a third of the stimulus I need for that set. And I got 5 more sets. There's no way I'll be able to do this. So work capacity starts to suffer. That's number one. Objectively, your health may not be the best at 25 to 30%. So, at some point your blood work's not that great. And it's just, you want to, we're all in this for at least somewhat health, and you want to kind of support health. Another problem is you actually can add adipocytes, add fat cells that never go away unless you surgery them out. And anything from 20 to 30%, you may add a significant amount of adipocytes if you've never been that fat before. And worse, or just as bad, you get loose skin that's also probably permanent. And loose skin is a bad thing because it looks like shit, but it's an even worse thing because it seems to be that in folks that want to get bodybuilding lean, their loose skin stores a crap load of body water that's very hard to get off. This is something I struggle with a ton in my own preps because I used to be 270 fat motherfucker, drug-free actually. And it's a bad thing that you don't want. So some degradation of health, some degradation of performance in the gym, which can directly impact hypertrophy. And you have some degradation of future ability to get lean, etc. Now, if we have those three things as negatives, we have to ask the question of what is the positive of continuing from 20% to 30%. There may be some positives in some situations, but if you started at 10-ish% or 15-ish%, you have two options fundamentally. One is you find yourself at 20%, you can recycle back to 10 to 12% doing a fat loss phase, which lasts 10 weeks, you should be just fine. Or you can keep going and keep massing. The downside of the 10-week fat loss phase is exclusively the fact that it takes 10 weeks. That's really just the downside. It's 10 weeks of your life gone, and you haven't added any muscle during that time. However, it brings you back to 10 to 12%, and then it builds what I call runway for your muscle gains to get to 20% again with fat, and then repeat the process. So you're reloading a clip in a gun. That's what it is. Now, if you have an extended clip on your gun, one of those huge drum clips, is that better than reloading clips? It could be in some cases if you want to keep shooting zombies, but the thing weighs a fuckload, and it's tough to balance, and it's tough to mount on anything. You have to run around with it, and anytime you do have to reload, you have to put all the bullets manually. It takes 2 hours. It's a huge pain in the ass, and you ask yourself, in this combat scenario, do I need a few clips to reload? Is that better? Or do we need a giant drum magazine? And especially because the drum comes with all these negative health consequences with the fat, not a ton of crazy ones, but nasty ones, and the proneness to being fatter later, and the body water issue with the loose skin and everything. For me, anytime I'm faced with a decision of someone who has gone from roughly 10% to about 20%, and they're asking, should I keep going 20 to 30, or should I cycle back down? Because I believe that P ratio is, as my reading of the current literature stands, roughly even between 10 and 20%, roughly even.
Right? Quite the range.
Quite the range. Because I think it's roughly even, I think, okay, if we back up to close to 10%, we give ourselves the most runway. And it's becoming pretty apparent that the best mass gain scenario is one in which you introduce a small surplus and you extend it over a long time. Maybe with some mini cuts in there, but like months, right? And how do you build yourself months of runway to gain mass? Well, you get leaner so that you don't have to worry about it. You can take all the time you need to get to 15 to 20%. And then voila, you put on tons of muscle. So to me, it's not so much that it's this magic 10 to 20 range. For me, it's when you're north of 20 and you want to keep gaining, then you think of the downsides. Do you still want to keep gaining? And in some cases, the answer may be yes. But in many cases, the answer is no. And to put a finer point on it, for competitive bodybuilders, the whole question is completely out, because if you're above 20% fat as a competitive bodybuilder, it's going to take you another 2 diets to get down. So you're going to take 1 diet to get down to 10%, which is a fucking long and brutal diet, and then another diet to get 10% to 3 or whatever you compete at, which is terrible. And then the other question is, for what? And it's like, well, I was having really great training at 20%. I figured, fuck it, I go to 30 or some shit like that, or whatever. I'm having great training at 15. I went to 20. Is that really worth all that bullshit for at best the same amount of muscle and at worst a smaller amount? To me, it's not clear at all if it's a good idea. So I'm a big fan of that 10 to 20 range, roughly. I don't think there's a big difference within that range, but I think that for folks who were saying, well, 20 to 30 is real productive range for gaining muscle, that's true. You can gain lots of muscle in that range, but you will be paying the costs in other ways. And sometimes even the muscle gains can be hampered in some exercises or muscle groups because you have such a huge fucking problem with cardio, essentially, and making all the actual training pushes that are required.
Very well. Just 2 questions in regards to those points. The first one being, is there a significant differences between natural versus enhanced? Because if we look at case studies in natural bodybuilders, we see hormones like testosterone plumbing, which I don't know if that constitutes the best health in regards to the body fat at hand. And the second question, what would constitute then a small surplus? As far as I'm aware of the literature, it would be something along 10 to 20% of our maintenance calories. Can we touch a little bit on those points, please, Dr. Mike?
Mm-hmm. So for natural competitors,
just to clarify a bit the first question, because you were talking that you were on your best health when you were the leanest, but I don't know if a natural bodybuilder could say the same. That's because all these case studies and on all that stuff that make me just question, is there a significant difference that we need to take into account? I'm sorry, that's it.
Well, so mind you, when I'm at my leanest, and when folks like me are at their leanest, that enhanced folks, I mean, we're on a ton of fucking bullshit, tren and VAR and all these awful, terrible drugs that destroy our health. They're still the healthiest during that time. That's how big of an impact being lean has. For natural bodybuilders, okay, so they experience low testosterone. What else?
In regards to hormones? Well, I'm talking about metabolic adaptations. All this not only hormonal, but let's say also in the metabolic rate. We also see a little bit.
What is unhealthy about a low metabolic rate?
Not unhealthy per se, but is there an impact that perhaps with enhanced athletes don't experience quite the same? It's just my question is a significant difference.
The only big impact I can see is if testosterone falls, is marginally less healthy, but very marginally. Women have almost no circulating testosterone, and they outlive men. So it strains credulity to think that testosterone is like this wellspring of health. Now, there's some good convincing literature to say that if it's too low or too high, it's not bad. It's not great for men. But mind you, for natural competitors, we're not talking about P ratios anymore. We're talking about close to the show. 10 to 3% is a different range, different discussion altogether than 10 to 20%. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So that's the one thing. On the other hand, so the only thing I would say, if someone was like, hey, I feel like I'm really unhealthy in my contest prep and I don't care if I'm drug free or not, I'd just be like, yeah, just do like TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, a very low dose through your prep, and you'll be super fucking healthy because you'll have all your testosterone, but damn near everything else will be just fine, right? So to me, it's not very, very clear to me that there's a ton of really bad health effects that are negative for natural bodybuilders when they're even in their leanest. Mind you, you have to juxtapose them with other health effects. If they take your resting heart rate, your blood pressure, etc. Natural bodybuilders, like I know guys who are in the 40s for resting heart rate when they're a week out from their show. And that's basically fucking immortal, right? Their blood pressure is like 90 over 45. It's insane. I understand how they're even upright, but that's the kind of stuff that if you chronically have that kind of blood work and those kinds of measurements, you're going to live a long ass time, right? So
Sure,
again,
sure.
but it's not something we want, especially for a long time, because let's be honest, it was the worst part about being natural and getting to super low body fats is that you feel like total shit and it's totally
Yeah.
completely out of any relevant discussion. You don't even know what's going on. You have no passion anymore. Like I'm getting pretty lean right now. You could probably see my face is all fucked up, but
Yeah, a
like
little bit.
I like. I look at like a very pretty, like I'm a fan of trees, especially like the fall. And I live in one of the northern states and the trees are beautiful and leaves are falling. And I'm like looking at it and I'm like, I don't feel anything. And I usually feel stuff. I'm like, where are my fucking feelings? So there's definitely all these other negatives from going that low. And the anabolic stuff doesn't help at all. So for natural bodybuilders, I'm not too concerned with poor health. I'll put it that way. Now, for the other question of, you said there were differences between naturals and enhanced. So here are the differences. There's probably no meaningful difference with the administration of anabolic steroids outside of the fact that when you are of higher body fat percentage, you tend to convert more of whatever steroid you have, provided it is convertible, to estrogen, which can be a good thing in some ranges and a bad thing in other ranges. So as you get north of 15 and probably north of 20, the average compound that will convert to estrogen will convert very highly, probably too highly, gain a bit of extra fat, body water, not the greatest anabolic environment, certainly not good for appearance, probably not ideal for muscle building. But if you have too low of estrogen and you're like 7% body fat, and you're like, yeah, I'm just going to fucking stay at 7 and gain because I'm on gear, who cares? Like your estrogen is real low at that point and probably not, estrogen is synergistically anabolic. So it helps. And if you don't have hardly any, that's not good. Also, you feel like shit. And again, you don't have any emotions or sex drive or ability to sleep or any of that shit. So a lot of times there's kind
Any
of
will to live, pretty much.
you don't even know what living is all about. You're like, I could
Yeah.
die. It wouldn't matter. I don't think there is a need to die.
Might as well just die.
Yeah, I'm pretty bored. I'll just die today. So there's a bit of a balance struck there. One of my consultants has huge influence on my life, Broderick Chavez. His job is to do pharmaceutical consultants. And he's basically, I used to be like, well, like where do I start my mass phases? Like 8%, 9%? Because I would mini cut and I would try to get nice and low to come back up. And he's like, dude, anything below 10 there's really a giant waste of time. And just get to 10 or 9 if you really want to, and then go slowly back up from there, right? So if you're if you're enhanced, that's really not a get out of jail free card for you to just be super fucking lean all the time and like pretend you're getting the best muscle gains. So because there are guys like that never get above like 8% fat, and they're like, yeah, I don't have to. I can still gain muscle if I run drugs. Like, yeah, that's true, but you don't get as much out of it, and you certainly won't get as jacked as you could be. On the other end of the thing, north of 15, 17%, something like that for the average person. With anabolics, as long as you handle the estrogen stuff, it's not a big deal. Although with anabolics, your health effects from the extra fat are much worse than they are if you're drug-free. So they're amplified, which is an independent way of saying maybe we shouldn't go that high if we're on drugs. Peptides change the equation. Even a moderate increase in your total body fat changes your insulin dynamics very substantially. If you are introducing exogenous insulin into that mix, so you're injecting insulin, then the insulin will be fractionally much more anabolic to fat than you want and much less anabolic to muscle tissue than you want. Those best effects of insulin occur when you're pretty fucking lean. I would say my best guess is under 17% fat. All right. So that is a consideration. Growth hormone. If you take growth hormone, it causes transient hyperglycemia, which is very bad for your health, especially managed poorly. And your probability of being more than transiently, but semi-stably hyperglycemic, if you take growth hormone, if you're eating a ton of food, which you have to be because you're massing, and your higher body fat percent starts to get real nasty. Like if you get between the 18 and 22% body fat range and you run 3 or 4 months of insulin and growth and tons of food, you could go to the doctor and the doctor's like, you're pre-diabetic. And you're like, holy fuck, like that sucks. You don't want that. So you don't want any part of that. And also it's not the most anabolic. So I'd say if you're using traditional anabolic androgenic steroids, using insulin and growth hormone in combination with a few other substances, I think your best bet is to stay somewhere between the 8% and 17% range, which is still a big range, almost the same as the other range, just down a few units, and that's where you're best at. Now, real quick, because you asked us earlier, and I sort of alluded to it, but didn't make it very clear. For those folks, so here's the thing. How do you tell what fucking body fat percent you are? You don't have to, because I can reword everything I said into visual appearance, okay? If you lose every bit of your abs, if you're already in good shape, have been in good shape, this is a different discussion for people that are starting pretty out of shape. If you are in good shape and you're starting your journey at roughly 10% fat and you're trying to gain, as soon as you lose sight of your abs, you're fucking done. You're done. Either way you slice it, growth hormone, not growth hormone, drug-free, not drug-free, I wouldn't get to the point where, like, once my abs blurred, there's no point in gaining anymore, because then you're probably getting into the negatives, right? Of like loose skin, extra adiposity, poor health, blah, blah, blah. Also, it becomes very difficult to convince people that you have anything to do with fitness, because they're like, I remember one time, this is funny, I was like, 250 or 255, drug-free, 5'6", and I was leaning over, I think I was training a lady in personal training in New York City before I got my PhD. I had a master's degree already. And I was leaning over a Smith machine to unrack it, and my shirt came up a little bit. And she saw, like, I had like a little bit of a gut, like pooch out. And she's like, "You have a gut?" And I was like, "I do." She's like, "I thought you were a trainer." And I was like, "Wow, that's how we're saying it. All in public and everything." And I handled it quite well. I was like, "Well, my goal is to get really big and strong. And I've been lean before. I know how to get you lean. You'll be okay." And she's like, "Okay." There's a lot of people who are clients just assume they're going to look like some kind of copy of their trainer eventually. So, it sucks to get that fat, even just for sociological reasons, but luckily I don't think there's a good reason to do it. So start out from when you're fucking lean, and then go until you can't see your abs or really start to get blurry for drug-free people. It's really good. Now, there's margins on both sides. You can get a little leaner, a little fatter, you'll be fine. But generally speaking, like, I don't want it to be like, hey, when's the last time you saw your abs? And you're like, oh, 6 months ago. Okay, you've been cutting now? And you're like, gaining. I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good idea. Now, on the other hand, for the growth hormone, that whole side of things, enhanced side, I would say that you want to stay reasonably lean year-round, which means you should have a pretty clear six-pack. Now, you begin a cycle, if you're on drugs properly, at like, oh my fucking God, you have veins in your abs and cross striations in your abs. And then you mass until you just have like a rough outline of a six-pack, and that's about it. And then you go back down, right? So and whatever body weight that occurs at, that's your highest body weight for the off-season during that push, and you come back down. I have done so much exploring of this landscape with clients. Unfortunately, sorry, clients, you did pay me that fees were assigned for services rendered. But for myself and my friends, I have many times tried to push beyond that zone when you're already a little bit fat, and I have nothing to show for it except for a tiny bit of muscle and a bunch of lifetime area under the curve summation of poor health. Like, like I had high blood pressure for XYZ extra number of weeks, or in my case, I always managed my blood pressure really well. But like, serum triglycerides were not ideal, or, my insulin A1C was a little higher than I'd like it to be. Why? Well, there's no good reason. There was no real big upside, so I might as well have capped it and gone back down. So that's my experience.
Very well. Just in regards to the second question, what would constitute then a small surplus? Because if we begin our whole massing phase with a small surplus, we can buy ourselves more time in the gaining zone, let's say, and not just go crazy with a surplus and then in 2-3 months get super fat, and then you have to cut again, and then you end up just spinning your wheels, as they say.
Sure. So, a surplus has to have at least two things we consider about it. One, it has to be enough calories to, on paper, make a difference. And two, it has to clear the signal-to-noise ratio, which means that we have to be able to do two things. One, impose the surplus and actually think we're getting it. And two, be able to be sure we're imposing it by measuring feedback with like our body weight and stuff and being like, oh, I really am in a surplus. Case in point, there are people out there advocating 50 calorie per day surpluses. Okay, so I'll tell you right now, if you use all the best food labels in the world, they don't get you within that accuracy. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's really marginal.
So it's pretend. And so somebody could say, well, if it's an average of 50, then we still win. Maybe. But you could think it's an average of 50, and for months of that time, you're actually at maintenance or even below. Can you imagine someone's like, how's your massing going? You're like, oh, it's great. And then you actually look and you're like, oh shit, I've gained zero amount of muscle, but I lost a few kilos of fat.
Right.
Well, that's not what the
There
fuck I
goes.
was doing here. What, right? Like, that's really
Right.
stupid. So for myself and Jared and James Hoffman, all the folks at RP that write the hypertrophy books and articles and make all the training programs, our opinion is, anything under about 150 calories extra per day is not worth calling a surplus. Anything from 150 calories per day to 500 extra calories per day seems reasonable. Anything north of a consistent 500 calorie per day surplus, it's probably just result in a little too much fat gain for the muscle that you gain. You still gain great muscle, and you can still diet off the fat and gain muscle again, but it's not healthy to eat that much food all the time. It's also not fun because people think, oh, massing's fun. I get a huge surplus. Like, once your post-show or post-diet hunger goes away, which only takes like 6 weeks, you look at food and you're like, God damn it, I have to eat all that? What the fuck? Like, and tomorrow I have to eat it too? So if you have a small surplus,
Oh, there I lost your.
can you hear me
Oh,
now?
there you go. There you go.
All right.
There you go. Cool.
The iPhone prefers the telephone feature always, and it
Yeah.
refuses to deprioritize that. So basically, you get too fat too fast, and you encounter more health problems, and it's really just not fun. And why do it? So on average, I think anywhere between a 150 calorie surplus, which is my comfortable bottom end for, like, we know we're really imposing a surplus. There's a very low chance that at 150 surplus of calories per day that you somehow are accidentally in maintenance the whole time, or somehow accidentally in a fat loss phase, and then all the way up to 500. And measurements should be taken. Great pumps, great strength. Hunger shouldn't be increasing as you continue to mass. It should be decreasing slowly, and also you should be gaining some scale weight every few weeks. So
Very well. Just to finish off, because as always, I want to be respectful of your time. Just some practical guidelines to know when it's safe to start a massing phase, a real massing phase, and when to maybe do a mini cut, and when to finish off better off the whole massing phase.
yeah, easy answers. When you look nice and lean to yourself, feel free to start massing. If in your heart of hearts you're like, nah, I'm not lean, and I know I'm not lean, cut. When you're nice and lean, start massing, go slowly until you look like you have faint semblance of abs is going away. And then you probably want to do a mini cut in order to buy yourself more runway. A couple of those mini cuts later, the mini cuts aren't enough. You take a maintenance phase, and then you go and do a real cut where you take all the body fat off, go back to being lean, and then you can restart the process. That's basically it. I mean, at the end of the day, start out when you're pretty lean, slowly go until you don't qualify as pretty lean anymore. Basically, like for most people, as such a faint outline of their abs remains, almost
Right.
flat. And then, and if you want to cut it shorter than that, cool, but that's up to you and your own trade-offs. I think anything in between there is good. And I think as long as you're massing for at least 2 months at a time, even if you mini cut every third month, I think you're gaining great amount of muscle over time. And you can, mass gain for up to 4 or 5 months at a time. People like to say they mass gain for longer. I don't think that's possible because the cumulative fatigue of training that hard requires some kind of active rest phase at least after those 5 months. So then really it's 2 weeks active rest, and then you start another 5 months or something like that. But anywhere between 2 and 5 months consecutive massing, and then mini cut and or real cut and or maintenance and or active rest, something to break, and then come back to it. And as long as you don't either get so lean that we're sort of winding the lawnmower rope back too far, or you don't get so fat that okay, there's nothing here for me, this downsides of health, blah, blah, then you're good to go. And by so lean, just to be clear, I mean, like, if you already have abs that are crisp and some veins, and you're like, okay, should I start massing now, or should I keep dieting to even more make more runway? My analogy here is you've backed up to the actual cement part of the runway, and now you're backing your plane onto fucking rocks and trees. Like,
Right.
can you accelerate from those? Yes, but you might break one of your wheels or something. There's nothing down below 9 to 10% body fat that's going to slingshot you back up. It's not. It's just more fatigue, and at that point, it's really hard work. So, it's kind of like, I don't know, prepping for a really fun party by like exercising a fuckload that day so you can look really lean, but then you show up to the party and you're tired as fuck and you fall asleep. Like, you're lean as it is, you're good to go.
Fits the purpose. Right.
Exactly.
Totally.
So because it's a huge temptation, right? Huge temptation for people to be like, well, fuck. Because once you get lean, you're like, I should just get leaner. And if that's what you want and it comports well with your schedule of shows that you have coming up, hey, sweet. But if you're just trying to get lean to potentiate mass, then anything below pretty lean is probably just a giant waste of time.
Very well. So one brief question, if you have the time, of course,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Mike. What do you think we can learn from all this P ratio discussion? Because I know, like we said, it's pretty nitty gritty. But what can we practically learn and apply from all the things we've learned recently?
Yeah. Don't chase psychotic leanness if your goal is mass gain. Lean is good for its own and not good for anything else once it's below 10% fat. If you're anywhere between 10 and 20% fat, roughly, which is anywhere between a very lean look and a just shy of chubby look, it's totally great. And you can gain muscle mass anywhere you want in there for as long as you like, and you can give yourself more runway or less based on how far down you want to cut. And then anything north of 20 to 25% fat, outside of some special circumstances for males. Females, by the way, add 7 to 10% to all of these numbers, and they all make sense. And then anything north of 20 to 25% for males is one of those things where you probably still get really good results, but with some nagging issues of health and longevity, work capacity, potential P ratio actually going south on you then a little bit worse. And then you kind of think like, oh, okay, well, 10 to 20% probably is the most productive range in most cases, especially folks that are interested in not just being a big, strong person, but being a big, strong, lean person eventually. And I think that's probably the best I have as far as a take home. And on a scientific note, my take home is that is probably one of the best advances in science and understanding comes from independent groups of people doing their own insight and coming to slightly or largely different conclusions, hashing it out, the rest of us learning, and then science moves forward based on consensus. I probably used to say a little bit too much that the P ratio mattered before Trexler got in the mix and tempered all of us. Then Menno got back at Trexler in a series of articles and debates, and Menno actually made some good points about the top ends of body fat, because up until then, I think Eric Trexler was kind of like, hey, look, when you get real fat, maybe that stuff happens, but definitely, it's not, when you're pretty fat. And then Menno had some pretty good citations. I was like, actually, you can expect some really not great shit to happen when you're fat. So to me, Eric did a great job explaining why anything below 10% was really stupid to try to diet into if you're trying to gain mass. And he said, 10 to 20 is probably roughly the same. And I think he even probably would say 20 to 30 is roughly the same. And I would say Menno kiboshed that 25% plus. And then the 20 to 25, I would say marginally, it's probably just with all the fat stuff that I was saying and the health stuff, work capacity stuff. I'd say that 20 to 25 also kiboshed on my end, so that we're left with, if you told Eric Trexler, okay, someone has a plan to go between 10 and 20% for the next 5 to 10 years and gain muscle and lose fat. Do you think that's bad? He'd probably be like, that sounds just fine. Whereas if you told him somebody has a plan to go between 40 and 50%, he might be like, okay, that's a lot. And if you told him someone, or if you told Menno that, or if you told Eric Trexler, like, I want to be between 5 and 10% all the time, he'd be like, you're an idiot. Like, you're just not going to get great results like that because you're so lean all the time. You can't even potentiate your body to gain as much muscle mass as possible. So I would say it's great to listen to a variety of voices, and also very bad to take a few studies out of context. Like the Forbes literature is very small, terrible external validity because it's not even on resistance trained people.
Totally.
Even if it was the best study of all time, it's just like 1 or 2 studies doesn't tell us a whole lot. And then on the other hand, the football studies of people gaining muscle, that is just a few studies also. And some of them it's not clear what they're saying. So we have to really, really be patient with getting more and better literature so we can learn more and better things and not be like, oh, when I got the study, I've got the citation. Like, oh, that's nice. Like in a freshman research methods course, you get a slow clap for finding citations. When you're an adult in the scientific community, you need a comprehensive body of literature and a theoretical underpinning and practical application to tie it all together. It's a little bit harder than just throwing up 5 studies and saying, oh, look, references, this must be true, where there's lots of ways in which you can get even a few references and the results are either externally unapplicable or just internally incorrect.
And it's always pretty cool to have those discussions for free. I pretty much watch them all, the Great Balkan Debate with Jeff Nipper, all the stuff, the Stronger by Science articles, all your contributions. So thanks a lot for that, Dr. Mike. And also, I don't want to take any more of your time. It's been a huge pleasure, like last time. It's great to have you back on the ground. So I hope we can do this again sometime. Sometime soon.
We will sometime soon. Reach out to me. Always a pleasure talking to you. You have such great questions. And
thank you, man.
What is it? Viva la raza mexicana? Is that like
Viva la raza?
La raza. Isn't that like an ethnic pride gang thing in like Los Angeles?
I don't know about Los Angeles, man. Maybe they have different cultures. It's a mixture of that. But you have to put some emphasis on the R, the raza, and then you can go and talk
Raza,
just
raza.
like that, just like
Perfect.
that.
I'm
So anyway,
almost Mexican. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later.
anytime, you're welcome. Have a
Bye
great
bye.
day.
You
Bye.
too.